Winter, 1893. The Shangum Ridge. A place where clouds touch stone. Where the Catskill Mountains rise like ancient sentinels, their peaks wrapped in mist and memory. Here, at nearly 2,000 feet above the Hudson Valley, the air bites with a clarity that makes everything, every pine needle, every distant farmhouse, seem carved from glass. This is Cragsmoor. And in this remote wilderness, something extraordinary is being built. Not a hunting lodge. Not a rustic retreat. A palace. Picture this. Italian marble columns rising from bedrock. Ballrooms with 20-foot ceilings. Gas-lit chandeliers imported from Paris. Servants' quarters hidden behind mahogany panels. All of it perched on a mountain, so remote that the nearest railroad stop is an hour's wagon ride through mud and ice. Beautiful. Yes. But here's what they don't tell you on the historical markers. Here's what you won't read in the local tourism brochures. This palace, the Cragsmoor Estate, was built by a man who had no money. Its foundation was laid on fraud. Its walls rose on secrets. And before it could stand for even a generation, it would become the site of financial collapse, suspicious fires, family madness, and a disappearance so disturbing that locals still won't speak the name after dark. This is the story of America's lost mountain palace. And if you stay with me, I'll show you why it vanished. Before we climb that mountain, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. This investigation took weeks of archival digging, and your support makes it possible. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The man who built Cragsmoor Estate was named Frederick Edwin Church, Jr. No, not the famous Hudson River School painter. That was his father. This is the son, the heir, the one history tried to forget. Frederick Jr. inherited a name soaked in artistic prestige. His father had painted Heart of the Andes, had dined with presidents, had built Olana, a Persian fantasy castle overlooking the Hudson that still stands today as a testament to genius and beauty. But Frederick Jr. was not his father. He was quieter, more withdrawn, a man who preferred numbers to brushstrokes, ledgers to landscapes. While his father created art that made the nation weep, Frederick Jr. studied engineering, railroads, finance. By 1890, he had carved out a respectable career as a railroad manager in New York. Respectable, not spectacular. He lived in his father's shadow, a shadow so vast it swallowed entire mountains. And then, in 1892, something changed. Frederick Jr. began buying land. Hundreds of acres. Remote, inaccessible, nearly worthless land high in the Shangums, in a scattered settlement artists had nicknamed Cragsmoor for its dramatic rock formations. His colleagues thought he was insane. Why would a railroad man, a man of steel and steam and urban efficiency, buy wilderness? But Frederick saw something else. He saw potential. And he had a plan. Or, rather, someone else had a plan for him. Enter Charles Pratt. If you don't recognize the name, you should. Charles Pratt was one of John D. Rockefeller's original partners in Standard Oil. A titan. A man whose wealth was measured not in millions, but in the reshaping of entire industries. Pratt owned railroads, refineries, politicians. And in 1892, Charles Pratt had a problem. One of his smaller railroad ventures, the Ulster and Delaware Line, which cut through the Catskills, was bleeding money. The route was inefficient. The competition was brutal. And investors were getting nervous. Pratt needed a distraction. He needed a story. He needed proof that the region had value, that the Catskills were more than just scenic poverty. He needed a symbol. So he found Frederick Church, Jr., a man hungry to escape his father's shadow, and made him an offer. Pratt would secretly fund the construction of a grand estate in Cragsmoor. Frederick would be the public face, the visionary patron of the arts, the gentleman farmer, the man building a cultural oasis in the mountains. The estate would attract artists, intellectuals, and tourists. It would drive up land values. It would make the Ulster and Delaware Railroad seem like a lifeline to civilization rather than a money pit. And Frederick? Frederick would finally have something his father never had, an empire of his own. There was just one problem. The money was a lie. Pratt wasn't investing his own capital. He was siphoning funds from the railroad itself, moving money through shell companies, fake invoices, and creative accounting that would make a modern CFO blush. Frederick either didn't know or didn't want to know. All he saw was the opportunity. And so, in the winter of 1893, as the American economy teetered on the edge of the worst depression in its history, construction began. Let that sink in for a moment. While banks were failing across the nation, while railroads were going bankrupt by the dozen, while families were losing their farms and their futures, Frederick Church Jr. was building a palace in the clouds. The irony was not lost on everyone. But up on that mountain, surrounded by snow and silence, it was easy to pretend the world below didn't exist. The site Frederick chose was breathtaking. A broad plateau nearly 2,000 feet above sea level, with views that stretched 50 miles in every direction. On clear days, you could see the Hudson River winding like a silver ribbon through the valley. You could see the distant Berkshires to the east, the Catskill High Peaks to the north. But the land itself was brutal. Bedrock, thin soil, exposed to every winter storm that roared down from Canada. Building here would require the same engineering audacity that had built the Brooklyn Bridge or the Transcontinental Railroad. Frederick hired the best. Stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from the Adirondacks, laborers, many of them Irish and German immigrants, willing to work for wages that barely covered their room and board at the construction camp. The design was ambitious. A 3-story mansion in the Second Empire style with a mansard roof, dormer windows, and a tower that would rise another 20 feet above the roofline. 40 rooms, servants' quarters, a library, a conservatory for exotic plants, stables for a dozen horses, and, most ambitiously, a private water system fed by a spring half a mile up the mountain. The cost? In 1890s dollars, approximately $200,000. In today's money, roughly $7 million. For a house in the middle of nowhere. To put that in perspective, at the same time, you could buy a comfortable brownstone in Manhattan for $15,000. But Frederick wasn't building comfort. He was building a statement. And as the walls rose, as the marble was set, as the chandeliers were hung, a strange thing happened. Artists began to arrive. Let's talk about what it actually took to build a palace on a mountain. Because the numbers alone tell a story of obsession. First, the materials. Every brick, every board, every pane of glass had to be hauled up that mountain by wagon. The nearest railroad depot was in Ellenville, 10 miles away as the crow flies, but nearly 15 by the rough mountain roads that existed in 1893. In winter, those roads became impassable. So Frederick did what any rational man would do. He built his own road, a private toll road, carved switchback by switchback up the mountainside. It cost nearly $30,000, almost as much as the house itself would have cost if built in a sensible location. But logic was not the governing principle here. This was about vision, about proving that civilization could be imposed on wilderness through sheer force of will and capital. The foundation alone required blasting bedrock with dynamite. The workers, many of them veterans of railroad construction, drilled holes by hand, packed them with powder, and retreated to watch stone explode into the sky. One man lost his hand. Another lost his hearing. A third died when a poorly set charge detonated early, sending shrapnel through his chest. His name was Sean Murphy. He was 23 years old. You won't find him in the historical records of the estate, but his grave is in the Catholic cemetery down in Ellenville, marked with a simple wooden cross that has long since rotted away. Once the foundation was set, the real work began. The exterior walls were built from local bluestone, a dense, gray sedimentary rock that gives the Hudson Valley its distinctive character. Quarried from the ridge itself, each block was cut and shaped by Italian masons who had learned their trade building cathedrals in Tuscany. These men were artists in their own right. They didn't just stack stone. They fitted each piece with a precision that required no mortar in the load-bearing sections. The walls could breathe, could flex with the freeze-thaw cycles of mountain winters, without cracking. Inside, the materials told a different story. Southern yellow pine for the structural framing, mahogany paneling from Honduras, marble fireplaces carved in Vermont, Tiffany glass windows shipped from New York City, each piece wrapped in straw and wool to survive the journey. The ballroom alone, just one room, consumed 40,000 board feet of lumber and took 6 months to complete. Picture the scale, a room large enough to host 100 guests, with a ceiling painted to resemble a summer sky, complete with gold leaf clouds. The floor was inlaid parquet, a geometric pattern of oak, walnut, and cherry that required a master craftsman working on his hands and knees for 3 solid months. The cost of that floor? $5,000. The annual wage of a skilled worker in 1893? About $600. Let that sink in. One room's floor cost the equivalent of 8 years of a working man's salary. But here's where it gets interesting. Frederick wasn't just building a showpiece. He was building a machine for living. The Cragsmore estate was designed to be entirely self-sufficient, a necessity, given its remote location. That meant infrastructure most houses of the era simply didn't have. Start with water. The spring Frederick tapped was 2,400 feet above sea level, higher than the house itself. Gravity would provide the pressure, but the spring was half a mile away, through dense forest and over broken terrain. So they dug a trench, by hand, 6 feet deep below the frost line, all the way from the spring to a cistern beneath the house. Then they laid cast iron pipe, hundreds of feet of it, each section weighing over 100 pounds. The system worked. Cold, pure mountain water flowing into the house at a pressure strong enough to reach the third-floor bathrooms. But water was just the beginning. Frederick wanted electricity. In 1893, that was not a given. Even in New York City, electric lighting was a luxury. Up here, in the mountains, it was unheard of. So Frederick built his own power plant, a small hydroelectric generator, powered by the same spring that fed the water system. It produced enough current to light the main rooms, not with the warm glow of gas lamps, but with the harsh, modern glare of Edison bulbs. The generator hummed day and night, a mechanical heartbeat buried beneath the floorboards. Guests found it unnerving. Servants found it unreliable. The system frequently failed, plunging the house into darkness without warning. When that happened, the staff had to scramble to light oil lamps and candles, all while maintaining the illusion that everything was under control. Because illusion was the point. Now let's talk about the people who kept this machine running. The servants. At full capacity, the Cragsmore estate required a staff of 20. A head butler, a cook, 2 assistant cooks, a housekeeper, 4 chambermaids, a laundress, 2 footmen, 3 groundskeepers, 2 stable hands, a coachman, and a caretaker who lived year-round in a cottage near the main gate. Most of them lived on the 3rd floor, in rooms so small you could touch both walls with your arms outstretched. No carpets, no decorations, just iron frame beds, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out over the forest. While Frederick and his guests dined on porcelain, the servants ate in a basement kitchen, their meals cooked from the previous day's leftovers. While the ballroom glowed with electric light, the servants' quarters relied on candles. This was the invisible architecture of luxury, the hidden labor, the concealed machinery, the people who made the dream function. And they were paid poorly. Chambermaids earned $3 a week. Groundskeepers, $5. Even the head butler, the highest-ranking servant, took home only $15 a week, and he was expected to source his own formal attire. Why did they stay? Some because they had no choice. Others because working for the church family, even the lesser church, carried a prestige that might open doors elsewhere. But many stayed because of the isolation. Up on that mountain, the rules of the outside world didn't quite apply. There were no neighbors to gossip, no police to enforce labor laws, no oversight. The estate was its own kingdom, and Frederick was its king. By the summer of 1895, the Cragsmore estate was finished. 40 rooms, electric lights, running water, a ballroom fit for European royalty. And Frederick Church Jr. stood in the entrance hall, looking up at the vaulted ceiling, and allowed himself, for just a moment, to believe he had succeeded. He had built something his father never had. A legacy carved not from paint, but from stone and iron and human will. But legacies, like houses, require foundations. And Frederick's foundation was rotten. Imagine you're a guest arriving at Cragsmoor in the summer of 1896. You've taken the train from New York City to Ellenville, a 3-hour journey through the Hudson Valley, past orchards and quarries and small towns still recovering from the panic of 1893. At the depot, a carriage is waiting. Frederick's carriage, polished black lacquer with brass fittings, pulled by a pair of matched bay horses. The driver says nothing as you climb in. He simply cracks the reins, and you begin to ascend. The road switchbacks up the mountain, each turn revealing a wider view of the valley below. Farms shrink to toy-sized patches. The Hudson River glints like a thread of silver. The air grows thinner, cooler, scented with pine and wild laurel. After an hour, you pass through a stone gate, the Cragsmoor estate, and suddenly, impossibly, there it is, rising from the plateau like something conjured from a fairy tale. 3 stories of bluestone and slate, with a tower that seems to pierce the clouds. Dormer windows catch the afternoon sun. The mansard roof gleams. The carriage circles a fountain, a marble Neptune surrounded by nymphs, water arcing from their outstretched hands. You step down onto gravel, and Frederick himself is there to greet you. Step inside. The entrance hall is designed to overwhelm. 30 feet high, with a grand staircase of carved oak spiraling upward. The walls are paneled in mahogany, polished to a mirror sheen. A chandelier, imported from France, dripping with crystal, hangs above your head, refracting afternoon light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. To your left, the library, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. First editions of Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, European philosophy, art criticism, scientific journals. Frederick was not a casual reader. This was a working library, the books annotated in his precise, slanted handwriting. But look closer. On the desk by the window, ledgers are stacked. Railroad reports, financial statements, letters with broken wax seals. Even here, in his sanctuary, the numbers followed him. To your right, the music room. A Steinway grand piano dominates the space. The walls are hung with paintings, not his father's work, but pieces by the younger artist Frederick was beginning to patronize. Landscapes of the Shangums, portraits of local farmers, studies of light and shadow that showed the influence of the French Impressionists. This was Frederick's gambit, to turn Cragsmoor into an artist colony, a place where painters, writers, and musicians could escape the noise of the city and create in the clarity of mountain air. He offered them lodging in the estate's guest wing. He provided studio space in converted outbuildings. He paid modest stipends, enough to cover materials and basic living expenses. In return, he asked only that they produce. And produce they did. By 1896, Cragsmoor had become a magnet for artists. Names you might recognize: Edward Lamson Henry, a painter known for his nostalgic depictions of rural America. Helen Turner, one of the few successful female artists of the era, whose luminous impressionist works now hang in major museums. Names you won't recognize, but should: Charles Courtney Curran, whose paintings of women in sunlit meadows captured a fleeting moment of American optimism. Frederick Dellenbaugh, an explorer and painter who had traveled the Grand Canyon with John Wesley Powell. These were serious artists, not dilettantes, not hobbyists, but professionals at the peak of their craft. And for a brief, shining moment, Cragsmoor became one of the most important art colonies in America. On summer evenings, the estate's ballroom transformed into a salon. Artists displayed their latest works. Musicians performed. Writers read from manuscripts still damp with ink. Frederick moved through these gatherings like a ghost, present but not participating, observing but not engaging. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in control. But step past the showpiece rooms. Walk down the narrow servants' corridor behind the kitchen. Here, the opulence ends. Bare plaster walls. Exposed gas pipes. The smell of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. This is where the real work happened. The cook and her assistants prepared meals for up to 30 people. Elaborate multi-course dinners for the guests upstairs, simple stews and bread for the staff below. The kitchen was brutally hot in summer, freezing in winter. The coal stove had to be fed constantly, and the ashes had to be hauled out before dawn so the guests wouldn't see the mess. Down another corridor, the laundry. 2 women worked here full-time, washing linens by hand in huge copper tubs. The water had to be heated on the stove, carried in buckets, poured, scrubbed, wrung, hung to dry. A single load, sheets for the guest rooms, took 4 hours. In a modern hotel, this work would be done by machines. Here, it was done by Mary Callahan and her daughter, Ellen. Irish immigrants. Paid $2.50 a week. They worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. On Sundays, they walked 3 miles down the mountain to attend Mass in the village. No one at the estate ever asked where they went. Now, go down one more level. The basement. This is the mechanical heart of the estate. The engine room. Here, the hydroelectric generator chugged away, its leather drive belt slapping against pulleys. The noise was constant, a rhythmic thump-thump-thump that you could feel in your bones. Next to it, the boiler. A massive cast-iron beast that heated water for the radiators upstairs. It required constant feeding, coal shoveled in every 2 hours, around the clock. The man who tended this boiler was named Thomas Grant. He was 56 years old, with lungs scarred from decades of breathing coal dust. He lived in a room adjacent to the boiler because someone had to be nearby in case the pressure built too high or the water level dropped too low. If the boiler exploded, and boilers did explode regularly in this era, Thomas would die instantly. He knew this. He stayed anyway. Because where else could a man with ruined lungs find work? This was the bargain at the heart of places like Cragsmoor. Beauty required resources. Comfort required labor. And the people who provided that labor were expected to remain invisible. Frederick understood this. He had grown up in a household where servants were simply part of the furniture, present, necessary, but unacknowledged. But something was shifting in America. The labor movements of the 1890s were gaining strength. Workers were organizing. Strikes were spreading from the factories to the railroads to the mines. Even in remote Cragsmoor, whispers of discontent began to spread among the staff. The wages were too low. The hours were too long. The working conditions, especially in the basement, were dangerous. In the summer of 1897, 3 servants quit without notice. Frederick replaced them within a week. But the message was clear. The invisible hands were becoming visible, and they were beginning to clench into fists. Yet for the guests upstairs, none of this mattered. They saw only the beauty. The sunlight streaming through Tiffany windows. The perfectly manicured gardens. The meals that appeared as if by magic. They painted their landscapes and wrote their poetry and believed, truly believed, that they were participating in something noble. A refuge for art. A sanctuary from the crass commercialism of the Gilded Age. They had no idea they were living in a house built on lies. Let's talk about money. Because in 1897, the money stopped. Charles Pratt, the oil magnate who had secretly funded the Cragsmoor estate, had a problem. His Ulster and Delaware Railroad, the venture he'd been propping up with creative accounting, was collapsing. The panic of 1893 had wounded it. The competition from larger rail lines had weakened it. But the final blow came from an unexpected source, a federal audit. The Interstate Commerce Commission, newly empowered to investigate railroad finances, began examining the Ulster and Delaware's books. And they found irregularities, payments to shell companies that didn't exist, invoices for construction materials that were never delivered, money flowing to a certain mountain estate in the Shangums, classified as rail development infrastructure. By early 1898, Pratt was facing potential fraud charges. His solution was simple: cut all ties, shut down the shell companies, stop the payments, and leave Frederick Church Jr. holding an estate he could not afford to maintain. Frederick didn't realize it immediately. The payments had always come through intermediaries, law firms, holding companies, distant financial instruments that Frederick barely understood. He had assumed the money was his. An inheritance, perhaps, or a loan secured against future railroad profits. It wasn't. When the payment stopped, Frederick did what any gentleman of his era would do. He wrote polite letters requesting clarification. Those letters went unanswered. He wrote more insistent letters. Still nothing. And then, in June of 1898, a lawyer appeared at the Cragsmore estate. Not Frederick's lawyer, Pratt's lawyer. The message was simple. The arrangement was over. The estate was Frederick's problem now. And if Frederick chose to make a public fuss about where the money had come from, well, there were certain financial records that might prove embarrassing. Records that showed Frederick had signed documents he claimed not to understand. Documents that might suggest he had been complicit in the fraud all along. The threat was clear. Stay quiet or go to prison. Frederick chose silence. Now, let's talk about what it cost to run the Cragsmore estate. Staff salaries, approximately $400 per month. Coal for heating, $150 per month in winter. Food and household supplies, $200 per month. Maintenance and repairs, $100 per month on average, but unpredictable. A burst pipe, a damaged roof tile, a broken window. Any of these could double the monthly expenses. Total, roughly $850 per month. Over $10,000 per year. In today's money, nearly $400,000 annually. Frederick's personal income from his railroad position? About $3,000 per year. Do the math. He was bleeding money at a rate that would bankrupt him within 18 months. He could sell the estate, of course. But to whom? It was 40 rooms in the middle of nowhere, requiring a full-time staff and a small power plant just to keep the lights on. It was unsellable. A palace had become a prison. Frederick tried to economize. He cut the staff from 20 to 12. The gardeners were dismissed. 2 of the chambermaids were let go. The coachman was fired, and Frederick began driving the carriage himself. The artist colony continued, but the stipends dried up. Artists were still welcome to stay. Frederick couldn't bear to close that part of his dream, but they had to cover their own expenses. Many left. By the fall of 1898, only a handful remained, the most loyal or the most desperate. The estate began to fray. Small things at first. The fountain in the courtyard stopped working. The pump had broken, and Frederick couldn't afford to fix it. The Neptune and his nymphs stood dry, their marble mouths gaping like the mouths of dead fish. The ballroom was closed off to save on heating costs. Dust began to settle on the parquet floor that had taken 3 months to install. One of the Tiffany windows cracked during a winter storm. Frederick covered it with boards rather than pay for repairs. The guests who still visited, fewer and fewer each season, pretended not to notice. But they did notice, and they talked. Frederick's wife, Catherine, had never wanted to move to Cragsmore. She was a city woman, raised in comfort in Albany, accustomed to theaters and social clubs and neighbors who didn't require an hour-long carriage ride to visit. The estate terrified her. The isolation, the silence, the way the wind howled through the tower at night, making sounds like voices. She begged Frederick to sell. He refused. She begged him to move the family back to New York, to keep the estate only as a summer retreat. He refused. The estate had become his identity. To abandon it would be to admit failure, to admit that he had been used, manipulated, left holding a monument to someone else's greed. And Frederick Church Jr. was too proud to admit that. So Catherine endured. She endured the winters when they were often snowed in for days at a time. The servants huddled in the kitchen for warmth because Frederick had shut down the heating system in half the house. She endured the summers when artists, strange, bohemian artists, wandered the halls at all hours, tracking paint and mud and creative chaos through rooms she had once been proud to host. And she endured the slow realization that her husband was breaking. In the spring of 1899, Frederick began to change. He had always been quiet, introspective, a man who kept his emotions tightly controlled. But now, the control was slipping. He stopped sleeping. Catherine would wake in the night to find his side of the bed empty, and she would go searching through the dark corridors past the empty guest rooms until she found him in the library, staring at ledgers by candlelight. The numbers didn't add up. They would never add up. He stopped eating regularly. The cook complained that she would prepare his meals and find them untouched hours later, cold and congealed on the dining room table. He stopped speaking to the servants, communicating only through curt written notes left on the kitchen counter. And he stopped painting. Frederick had never been a serious painter, not like his father, but he had dabbled, had produced competent watercolor landscapes in his youth. Now he tried again. Perhaps art could be an escape, a way to connect with the legacy he had tried so hard to build. But when Catherine found the canvases in his studio, they were disturbing. Dark, chaotic swirls of color. Landscapes that looked diseased, the trees twisted, the skies bruised. And faces. Faces emerging from the shadows, distorted and anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. Catherine asked him what they meant. Frederick said nothing. He simply returned to the library, to the ledgers, to the numbers that refused to balance. By the summer of 1899, the Cragsmore estate had become a place of ghosts. Not literal ghosts, not yet, but the ghosts of ambition, of dreams that had curdled into obsession, of money spent and lives disrupted and labor extracted, all for a beauty that was already beginning to rot. The artists had abandoned it. The servants were restless, unpaid for weeks at a time, staying only because they had nowhere else to go. And Frederick Church, Jr., the man who had built a palace to escape his father's shadow, found himself trapped in a shadow of his own making, darker, colder, and growing by the day. We need to talk about the son. His name was Edward Livingston Church. Born in 1885, he was Frederick and Catherine's only child. A quiet boy, bookish like his father, but with a fragility that worried everyone who knew him. He was 14 years old when the family moved to Cragsmore in 1895. 14, an age when boys should be exploring, making friends, testing boundaries. But there were no other children on the mountain, no school, no neighbors, just the vast, empty wilderness and the increasingly unstable adult world inside the estate. Frederick hired a tutor, a severe man from Boston who believed education was a matter of discipline and rote memorization. Edward hated him. Catherine tried to supplement the lessons with music and art, teaching Edward piano in the music room. But Edward had no talent for it. His fingers stumbled over the keys, and his frustration would build until he slammed the lid shut and fled to his room. As the estate's finances collapsed, as Frederick's mental state deteriorated, Edward became more and more isolated. He stopped taking lessons. The tutor was dismissed, one more expense Frederick could no longer afford. Edward began to wander. Picture this, a teenage boy, alone, walking the mountain trails for hours at a time. He would leave after breakfast and not return until dusk, his clothes covered in mud and pine needles, his hands scratched from pushing through underbrush. Catherine begged him to stay close to the house. Edward ignored her. What was he doing out there? According to the few servants who remained, Edward was building things. Cairns, piles of stones, stacked in odd formations, appeared along the trails. Some were simple, just 3 or 4 rocks balanced precariously. Others were elaborate, spiraling structures that seemed to serve no purpose. He carved symbols into trees. Not words, symbols. Geometric patterns, circles within circles, lines radiating outward like spokes. When Catherine confronted him, Edward said he was marking the territory. From what? He didn't say. In the winter of 1899, the same winter Frederick stopped sleeping, Edward stopped speaking. Not entirely. He still responded when directly addressed. But he no longer initiated conversation. He no longer ate meals with his parents. He took his food to his room and ate alone, staring out the window at the snow-covered forest. Catherine was terrified. She wrote letters to her sister in Albany, describing Edward's behavior, begging for advice. Her sister wrote back, "Send him to us. Get him off that mountain. The isolation is poisoning him." Catherine showed the letter to Frederick. Frederick refused. The family would stay together. They would endure. Sending Edward away would be an admission that Cragsmore had failed, that Frederick had failed. And so Edward remained, and the silence in the house deepened. In the spring of 1900, one of the chambermaids, a young woman named Alice, made a disturbing discovery. She was cleaning the third floor, the servants' quarters that were now mostly empty, when she noticed something strange in one of the unused rooms. The walls were covered in writing, not with ink or paint, carved directly into the plaster, hundreds of shallow scratches forming words and phrases. Most of it was illegible, but some phrases were clear. They are watching. The trees know. Father is hollow. I will disappear. Alice reported it to Catherine. Catherine went to look for herself. And there, in the corner of the room, sitting on the bare floor, was Edward. He was holding a nail. His fingertips were bloody. He looked up at his mother and smiled. I'm almost done, he said. Let that sink in. A 15-year-old boy, carving paranoid messages into the walls of an empty room, his hands torn and bleeding, and smiling. Catherine wanted to bring in a doctor, a psychiatrist from New York, but Frederick refused. There was nothing wrong with Edward, he insisted. The boy was simply creative, expressing himself in unconventional ways. Artists did that. The church family had always produced eccentric thinkers. This was normal, but it wasn't normal, and everyone knew it. Edward's behavior grew stranger. He began leaving the house at night. Servants would hear the front door open in the early hours before dawn. They would look out their windows and see Edward's silhouette moving through the gardens, up the trails, disappearing into the dark forest. Catherine tried locking his bedroom door at night. Edward escaped through the window. She tried staying awake to watch him. She would fall asleep, exhausted, and wake to find him gone. Where was he going? The groundskeeper, an older man named Thomas, who had stayed on despite the unpaid wages, decided to follow him. One night in June of 1900, Thomas watched Edward leave the house around 2 a.m. He followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Edward walked for nearly an hour, climbing higher up the mountain, past the estate's boundaries, into the wild forest where no trails existed. And then Edward stopped. He stopped in a small clearing, surrounded by hemlock trees, and began to dig. With his bare hands. Thomas watched, hidden behind a tree, as Edward clawed at the earth, pulling up rocks and roots, digging a shallow depression about 2 feet deep. Then Edward lay down in the hole. He lay there, perfectly still, staring up at the sky. For over an hour, Thomas didn't know what to do. He was frightened, not of Edward, but for him. Finally, just before dawn, Edward climbed out of the hole, brushed the dirt from his clothes, and walked back to the estate. Thomas followed. Neither spoke of it. In July of 1900, Frederick made a decision. The estate was unsustainable. The debts were mounting. The staff was down to 6 people, and even they were threatening to leave. Something had to give. Frederick decided to host one final event, a grand exhibition of the Cragsmore artist colony's work. He would invite critics from New York, potential patrons, anyone who might bring money or prestige or attention. It would be a last, desperate gamble to save the estate. He poured what little money remained into preparations. The ballroom was reopened and cleaned. The dust was swept away. Canvases were hung on the walls, works by the few artists who still remained, and older pieces from the colony's glory days. Catherine helped, because what else could she do? And Edward? Edward was told to stay in his room during the event. He was not to interact with the guests. He was not to be seen. He was an embarrassment, a secret. The exhibition was scheduled for August 10, 1900. Invitations were sent. A small notice appeared in the New York Times. Responses were lukewarm. Most of the critics declined. A few patrons, out of pity or curiosity, said they would attend. Frederick told Catherine it would be enough. If even one patron decided to invest to support the colony, it might buy them another year. One more year to find a solution. One more year to hold on. Catherine didn't believe him, but she said nothing. The days before the exhibition were tense. The staff worked frantically, preparing the house, polishing surfaces that hadn't been polished in months. Frederick rehearsed his speech, standing in the ballroom, addressing rows of empty chairs. And Edward? Edward carved another message into the wall of his room. This one was different. Just 2 words, scratched deep into the plaster. It's time. No one saw the message until later. Much later. After everything had burned. August 9th, 1900. The night before the exhibition. The estate was quiet. The preparations were complete. The paintings were hung. The ballroom gleamed. Catherine had gone to bed early, exhausted from days of frantic work. Frederick was in the library, reviewing his notes for tomorrow's speech. And Edward was in his room. Or so everyone thought. The fire started sometime after midnight. The exact cause was never determined. The official report, filed weeks later by a county inspector, listed it as accidental, likely due to faulty electrical wiring. But there were problems with that conclusion. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously: the ballroom, the library, and the 3rd-floor servants' quarters. 3 separate points of origin, all igniting within minutes of each other. Electrical fires don't do that. Thomas Grant, the caretaker who still lived in the basement near the boiler, woke to the smell of smoke. He ran upstairs. The ballroom was an inferno. The paintings were engulfed, months of work, years of artistic effort, consumed in seconds. The parquet floor, that masterpiece of inlaid wood, was buckling and charring, flames racing along the seams. Thomas shouted for help. The few remaining servants stumbled from their rooms, coughing, disoriented. Where was Frederick? Where was Catherine? Thomas ran to the family's wing. He found Catherine in the hallway, trying to reach Edward's room. The corridor was filled with smoke. She was crawling on her hands and knees, calling her son's name. Thomas grabbed her, pulled her back. The flames were too intense. No one could reach Edward's room. Catherine screamed. Thomas dragged her toward the stairs, toward the exit. They made it outside. The servants huddled in the courtyard, watching as the Cragsmore estate, this palace built on lies and ambition, burned against the night sky. The flames were visible for miles. Down in the valley, people woke and looked up at the mountain, seeing the orange glow, thinking perhaps the sun was rising early. But it wasn't the sun. It was the end of a dream. Where was Frederick? Catherine, hoarse from screaming, realized he was still inside. She tried to run back in. Thomas held her back. And then, through the smoke and flames, a figure appeared. Frederick, walking calmly out the front door, as if leaving for a morning stroll. His clothes were singed. His face was blackened with soot. But he was alive. Catherine ran to him, crying, asking about Edward. Frederick stared past her, at the burning house. He said nothing. The Cragsmore Volunteer Fire Brigade arrived 2 hours later. By then, there was nothing to save. The roof had collapsed. The tower had fallen. The walls were still standing. Bluestone doesn't burn, but everything inside was ash. The ballroom, the library, the conservatory, the servants' quarters, gone. The firefighters poured water on the ruins until dawn, ensuring the blaze wouldn't spread to the surrounding forest. And as the sun rose over the Shangum Ridge, illuminating the smoke and the destruction, someone finally asked the question that Catherine had been too terrified to voice. Where is Edward? They searched the ruins. It took 3 days. The heat had been so intense that metal fixtures had melted. The grand piano was reduced to twisted wires and charred wood. The Tiffany windows had shattered. The glass fragments fused into grotesque globs. They found no body in Edward's room. No bones. No remains. Just ash. The official conclusion was that Edward had perished in the fire, and his remains had been completely consumed by the heat. Catherine insisted on a funeral. A closed casket was buried in the family plot in Albany. It was empty. But here's where the story gets strange. Thomas Grant, the caretaker, gave a statement to the county inspector that was later buried in the file. He said he had seen Edward. Not before the fire. During the fire. Thomas claimed that as he was dragging Catherine from the house, he looked back and saw Edward standing in the 3rd-floor window. Not trying to escape. Not calling for help. Just standing. Watching. And then the window exploded outward, and Edward was gone. The inspector dismissed this as a trauma-induced hallucination. But there was another witness. One of the chambermaids, Alice, the same woman who had found Edward's carvings, reported something similar. She said she had seen Edward outside, standing at the edge of the forest before the fire was fully extinguished. She called out to him. He turned, looked at her, and walked into the trees. She followed, but when she reached the tree line, there was no one there. No footprints, no sound, just the wind. The inspector didn't include these statements in his official report. He didn't want the case to become a spectacle. A wealthy family, a destroyed estate, a missing boy. This was already tragic enough without adding ghost stories. But the rumors spread anyway. Locals began to talk about Edward's strange behavior in the months before the fire, about the carvings on the walls, about the fires starting in 3 places at once. And slowly, a darker theory began to take shape. What if Edward set the fire? What if the boy, broken by isolation and his father's madness, had decided to burn it all down? And what if he had escaped into the forest, choosing the wilderness over the ruins of his family? There's no proof, no confession, no physical evidence. But the theory persists, because Edward's body was never found. And because in the years that followed, people hiking the trails around Cragsmoor reported strange things. Cairns that appeared overnight, symbols carved into trees, the feeling of being watched, and occasionally, very occasionally, a glimpse of a figure moving through the forest. Young, thin, dressed in clothes that seemed decades out of fashion. A figure that vanished the moment you tried to follow. Frederick and Catherine never spoke publicly about the fire. They moved back to Albany. Frederick took a job as a clerk in a shipping office. The man who had built a palace was reduced to filing invoices for $15 a week. He died in 1908 of a stroke at the age of 53. Catherine lived another 20 years, but she never remarried, never left Albany, never spoke of Cragsmoor except to say it had been a mistake. She died in 1928. Her last words, according to the nurse who attended her, were, "Tell Edward I'm sorry." But Edward, if he existed, if he survived, never came home. The empty casket in Albany remains undisturbed. And up on the mountain, the ruins of the Cragsmoor estate stood silent, waiting. In the weeks after the fire, journalists arrived. Not many. The Cragsmoor estate was remote, and the Church family, despite their famous name, was not front-page news. But a few reporters from the regional papers made the trek up the mountain. They photographed the ruins. They interviewed the remaining servants. They tried, unsuccessfully, to get a statement from Frederick. The stories they published were sympathetic. Tragic fire destroys mountain estate. Church family loses son in blaze. Cragsmoor art colony in ashes. But there was one journalist who dug deeper. His name was Samuel Pierce, and he worked for a small investigative weekly out of Kingston called the Ulster County Ledger. Pierce didn't believe in accidents. Pierce started with the basics. He obtained the fire inspector's report. He noted the 3 points of origin. He spoke to Thomas Grant, who was now unemployed and willing to talk for the price of a hot meal. Thomas told Pierce about Edward's strange behavior, the nighttime wandering, the hole in the forest. Pierce spoke to Alice, the chambermaid, who described the carvings in the walls and her sighting of Edward after the fire. And then Pierce did something no one else had thought to do. He followed the money. Pierce went to the county clerk's office and pulled every property record, every deed, every lien associated with the Cragsmoor estate. What he found was a mess. The estate had been mortgaged 3 times. The first mortgage, taken out in 1893, had been quietly paid off by an anonymous holding company. The second mortgage, from 1896, had been defaulted on. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings, but then mysteriously dropped them. The third mortgage, from 1899, was held by a company Pierce had never heard of, Ulster Development Associates. He traced the company through layers of paperwork. It didn't exist. It was a shell, a legal fiction. The address listed on the incorporation documents was a vacant lot in Albany. Someone had been funneling money to Frederick, or pretending to, while simultaneously setting up a structure that would allow them to seize the estate if Frederick failed to pay. And Frederick had failed. Pierce dug further. He found the connection to Charles Pratt, found the railroad contracts, found the invoices for infrastructure development that matched the construction costs of the estate. He found the fraud. And in September of 1900, Pierce published his findings. The article was titled, "The Palace Built on Lies: How a Railroad Baron's Scheme Destroyed a Family." It named names. It detailed the shell companies, the fake loans, the misappropriated funds. It stopped just short of accusing Pratt of arson, but the implication was there. The article was published on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Samuel Pierce was out of a job. The owner of the Ulster County Ledger, who, it turned out, had business ties to Pratt's railroad, fired Pierce and pulled the article from circulation. Only a few dozen copies had been distributed before the print run was destroyed. Pierce tried to take the story to larger papers in New York City. No one would touch it. Charles Pratt was too powerful, too connected. The Gilded Age was the age of robber barons, and the press, for all its bluster, knew not to bite the hand that fed it. Pierce died in 1903, broke and bitter, his reputation destroyed. But a few of those printed articles survived, and historians, decades later, would find them. While Pierce was conducting his investigation, Frederick Church Jr. was facing his own reckoning. The estate was gone, but the debts remained. The unpaid mortgages, the unpaid staff wages, the unpaid bills from suppliers, contractors, and tradesmen who had worked on the estate over the years. Lawsuits began to pile up. Frederick had no assets. His salary was barely enough to cover rent on a modest apartment in Albany. In 1901, he declared bankruptcy. The proceedings were a public humiliation. Creditors testified about the luxury of the estate, the marble, the chandeliers, the imported materials, while Frederick sat silent, unable to explain where the money had come from, because explaining would mean admitting to the fraud. And Pratt's lawyers were in the courtroom watching. The implicit threat was clear: stay quiet or face criminal charges. Frederick stayed quiet. The bankruptcy court seized what little remained: the ruins of the estate, the land, the few pieces of furniture and artwork that had survived. It was all auctioned off. The estate's bluestone walls were dismantled and sold as building material. Farmers from the valley hauled away wagon loads of stone to build foundations and retaining walls. The land itself was divided into parcels and sold to speculators who hoped to develop it into a resort community. That never happened. The land was too remote, too rugged, and by 1901, the Cragsmore Artist Colony had a reputation not for beauty, but for tragedy. No one wanted to build there. By 1905, the site of the Cragsmore estate was abandoned. The foundation remained, too massive to dismantle easily, but everything else was gone. Nature began to reclaim it. Saplings pushed up through cracks in the stone. Vines covered the walls. The fountain, dry for years, filled with rainwater and became a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Local children dared each other to explore the ruins. Most turned back before reaching them. There was something wrong with the place, something that made the air feel heavy, the silence too deep. Some claimed they heard voices. Others said they saw lights moving through the trees at night. The old stories about Edward resurfaced. Was he haunting the ruins? Was he still alive, living wild in the forest? No one knew, and no one wanted to find out. For decades, the Cragsmore estate was forgotten. It didn't appear in histories of the Gilded Age. It wasn't mentioned in biographies of the Church family, those focused on Frederick Edwin Church Sr., the famous painter, not his failed son. The few people who remembered it referred to it only as that folly on the mountain. But in the 1960s, something changed. A graduate student studying Gilded Age architecture stumbled across a reference to the estate in a footnote of a railroad company report. Intrigued, he began to dig. He found Pierce's suppressed article in a private collection. He found the bankruptcy records. He found the servant testimonies. And he found photographs. Photographs taken before the fire, showing the estate in its brief glory. The ballroom, the library, the tower reaching toward the sky. He published a paper, The Lost Palace of Cragsmoor, a case study in Gilded Age excess and collapse. It was a minor academic work, read by a few dozen scholars. But it was enough to put Cragsmoor back on the map. In the 1970s, historic preservationists became interested. They surveyed the ruins. They documented what remained. And they realized something remarkable. Despite decades of neglect, the foundation was still structurally sound. The underground cistern still held water. The channels for the hydroelectric system were intact. The engineering that Frederick had poured so much money into, the invisible infrastructure, had survived. In 1982, the site was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Not as a grand mansion, but as an archaeological site representing early experiments in self-sufficient mountain estates. A small plaque was installed at the trailhead, giving a sanitized version of the history. It mentioned the artist colony. It mentioned the fire. It did not mention Edward. It did not mention the fraud. And it did not mention the rumors. But the rumors didn't need official acknowledgement to persist. Because strange things continued to happen at Cragsmoor. Hikers reported finding cairns that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh carvings appeared on trees near the ruins, symbols that matched the ones Edward had carved a century earlier. And the lights. Always the lights. On certain nights, always in late summer, around the anniversary of the fire, people claimed to see lights moving through the ruins. Not flashlights, not campfires, something else. A cold, blue-white glow that hovered and drifted, then vanished without a trace. The Forest Service investigated multiple times. They found no evidence of trespassers, no signs of recent activity, just the ruins, and the wind, and the overwhelming sense that something was watching. In 1995, a local filmmaker attempted to make a documentary about the Cragsmoor estate. He spent 3 nights camping at the site, recording footage and conducting interviews with historians and locals. On the 3rd night, his camera captured something. A figure, moving through the frame for just 2 seconds. Tall, thin, moving with an unnatural stillness. The filmmaker reviewed the footage. He never returned to Cragsmoor. He abandoned the documentary. When asked why, he would only say, "Some stories don't want to be told." Let's talk about what Cragsmoor means today. Because the estate, even in ruins, refuses to die. In 2003, after years of lobbying by preservationists and local historians, the New York State Parks Department took formal control of the site. They designated a 50-acre zone around the ruins as a protected historic area. No development. No commercial activity. No removal of materials. The stated goal was to preserve what remained for future study and to prevent further vandalism. But there was an unspoken reason. They wanted to contain it. The official maps show trails leading to the site. There are informational plaques at intervals, describing the history in carefully neutral language. But if you visit Cragsmoor today, you'll notice something odd. The main trail stops about 200 yards from the ruins. There's a sign, unstable structure. Do not enter. The path beyond is overgrown, deliberately unmaintained. The message is clear, look, but don't touch. Remember, but don't explore. Why? The official explanation is safety. The remaining stonework is unstable. The ground is uneven. Liability. But talk to the park rangers off the record, and you'll hear a different story. In 2008, a ranger named Michael Torres was assigned to patrol the Cragsmoor zone. It was a quiet posting. Most visitors stayed on the main trails, took a few photos of the distant ruins, and left. But Torres took his job seriously. He wanted to understand the site, to be able to answer visitors' questions with authority. So he began exploring the ruins themselves. He documented what remained. Sections of the foundation, fragments of the walls, the old cistern still holding dark, still water. And he found the carvings. Not just on trees, on the stones themselves. Someone had been carving into the bluestone blocks. Recently, the marks were fresh, the edges sharp. Symbols. The same geometric patterns Edward had carved a century before. Torres reported it. An investigation was launched. No evidence of trespassers was found. No footprints, no discarded tools, no signs of recent human activity. Just the carvings. Fresh and inexplicable. Torres continued his patrols. And he began to notice other things. The temperature around the ruins was always 10 degrees colder than the surrounding forest. Even in summer, animals avoided the area. No birds nested in the nearby trees. No deer trails crossed the foundation. And there was the smell, faint but unmistakable, with smoke and something else. Something chemical and wrong. Torres assumed it was residual contamination from the fire, chemicals leaching from the soil after a century. But the smell wasn't constant. It came and went, and it was strongest at night. In October of 2009, Torres was conducting a routine patrol just after sunset. He was walking the perimeter of the protected zone when he saw it. A light, blue-white and pulsing, moving through the ruins. His first thought was trespassers with a flashlight. He called out, identified himself as a ranger, and approached. The light stopped moving. Torres got closer, maybe 50 feet away, and realized this wasn't a flashlight. The light had no source. It wasn't emanating from a device or a person. It simply existed, hovering about 4 feet off the ground, casting no shadows. And then it moved toward him. Fast. Torres ran. He's not ashamed to admit it. He ran back to his truck, locked the doors, and sat there until dawn. When he returned to the site the next morning, there was nothing. No light. No footprints. No explanation. He filed a report. It was buried. Torres wasn't the only one. Other rangers reported similar experiences. Lights, sounds, footsteps, voices, the distant clang of construction. In 2011, the Parks Department quietly implemented a new policy. No solo patrols at Cragsmoor after dark. The official reason? Wildlife activity. But everyone knew. In 2015, a paranormal investigation team requested permission to conduct an overnight study at Cragsmoor. The Parks Department denied the request. The team showed up anyway. They were arrested for trespassing. But before they were removed, they managed to set up recording equipment, audio and infrared cameras, hidden in the ruins. The equipment ran for 6 hours before the batteries died. When the team reviewed the footage later, after getting out of jail, they found something. At 2:47 a.m., the infrared camera captured a figure, standing in the center of what had once been the ballroom. The figure was human-shaped but wrong. Too tall, too thin, the proportions distorted. It stood motionless for 3 minutes. And then it turned, looked directly at the camera, and moved forward. The footage cut out. The team tried to publish the footage online. It was removed within hours. Copyright claim, filed by an entity they couldn't trace. The team members were contacted by lawyers and told, in no uncertain terms, that further attempts to publicize the footage would result in legal action. They complied. But copies of the video exist. If you know where to look, you can find them. I won't link them here, but they're out there. And once you've seen that figure, the way it moves, the way it turns, you understand why the Parks Department wants the site contained. Here's the question no one wants to ask. What if Edward never left? Not as a living person hiding in the forest. Not as a ghost in the traditional sense, but as something else. Something that became part of the land itself. Part of the stone and the trees and the cold, dark water in the cistern. What if the isolation, the trauma, the final act of burning it all down, what if that bound him to this place in a way that death couldn't break? I know how that sounds. I'm a researcher, not a ghost hunter. I deal in documents and dates and verifiable facts. But I've been to Cragsmoor. I've stood at the edge of the protected zone, looked at those distant ruins, and felt it, the wrongness, the sense that the place is waiting for something, or someone. In 2018, the Parks Department commissioned a geological survey of the site. The official purpose was to assess erosion and plan for long-term preservation. But the survey uncovered something unexpected. Beneath the foundation, the ground-penetrating radar detected a void, a space roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, about 8 feet below the surface. A room, or a tomb. The survey team wanted to excavate. The Parks Department refused. The site was sealed. The survey results were classified as internal use only. But one of the surveyors talked to a local reporter. He said the void wasn't natural. It had been dug, deliberately, and there was something in it. The radar couldn't determine what, metal, bone, stone, but something was there. Something that had been hidden for over a century. Was it Edward? Did he dig that hole in the months before the fire, the hole Thomas Grant saw him lying in? And then later, when the flames consumed everything, did he crawl into it and seal himself away? Or is it something else? A cache of documents? Evidence of the fraud? A final message from Frederick, hidden before his world collapsed? We don't know. The Parks Department won't excavate. And maybe that's for the best. Because some secrets, once uncovered, can't be buried again. Today, Cragsmoor exists in a strange limbo. It's a protected, historic site, but one that actively discourages visitors. It's a place of documented tragedy, but one where the full truth has never been told. It's a ruin, but one that refuses to be merely a ruin. Local guides won't take tourists there. The few hikers who find it don't stay long. And on certain nights, late summer, when the air is still and the stars are bright, lights still appear. Dancing through the ruins. Moving through the trees. Waiting. Always waiting. Let's talk to the people who live near Cragsmoor today. Because they remember things the history books don't record. The Shangum Ridge is sparsely populated, a handful of small towns, scattered farms, vacation homes built in the 1950s and 60s. The people here are quiet, practical, not given to wild speculation. But ask them about Cragsmoor, and their faces change. I spoke to a woman named Margaret Keene, whose family has lived in Ellenville for 5 generations. Her great-grandmother worked at the Cragsmoor estate in 1899. One of the chambermaids who left before the fire. Margaret's great-grandmother never spoke about the experience in detail. But she told her daughter, Margaret's grandmother, one thing. Never go back to that mountain. The house is wrong. The boy is wrong. And the forest knows. What did that mean? Margaret's grandmother didn't know. But the warning was passed down. And to this day, Margaret's family won't hike the trails near the ruins. I spoke to a man named Robert Dalton, a retired schoolteacher who has lived in the area since the 1970s. Robert is a skeptic. He doesn't believe in ghosts or curses or any of the local folklore. But in 1983, Robert and his wife decided to hike to the Cragsmoor ruins. It was a clear autumn day. Beautiful. The kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. They followed the trail, reached the edge of the protected zone, and kept going. The signs said do not enter, but they were curious. They wanted to see the ruins up close. They walked for 10 minutes. The ruins should have been visible by then. They'd seen them from a distance. But they weren't. The forest just continued. Dense, dark, unchanging. Robert checked his compass. They were heading in the right direction. They walked for another 20 minutes. Still nothing. And then Robert realized the forest was silent. No birds. No insects. No wind in the trees. Just silence. His wife grabbed his arm. We need to leave. Robert agreed. They turned around and walked back. Within 5 minutes, they were back at the trail. The normal trail, with the signs, with the sounds of birds and distant traffic. They had been gone less than an hour. But when they checked their watches, 3 hours had passed. Robert tried to rationalize it. They'd gotten lost, disoriented. Time had slipped because they were distracted. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't wanted them there. And something had moved them away. I spoke to a forest ranger, not Torres, but someone else who worked the area in the 2000s. She wouldn't let me use her name. She told me about the calls they get. Every few months, someone reports being lost near Cragsmoor. Experienced hikers. People with GPS devices, topographic maps, years of backcountry experience. They call panicked, saying they can't find their way out. Rangers respond. They follow the GPS coordinates. And the hikers are never far from the main trail. Sometimes within 100 feet. But when the rangers find them, The hikers are disoriented, confused, sometimes injured from falls or exhaustion. They all say the same thing: the trails kept moving. The ranger told me about one incident in 2012. A college student, solo hiking, called for help. He was near Cragsmoor, he said, and couldn't find his way back. The ranger hiked in, following his GPS signal. She found him sitting on a rock, staring at the ruins in the distance. He was crying. She asked what was wrong. He said, "He told me not to leave. He said I have to stay." "Who told you?" The student pointed toward the ruins. "The boy. The one who's been watching me." There was no one there. The ranger got the student out, brought him to the medical station. He was dehydrated, mildly hypothermic. He refused to talk about what he'd seen. 3 days later, he dropped out of college and moved back to Ohio. The ranger tried to follow up, to get a statement for her report. He never answered her calls. These stories are not isolated. They are not folklore passed down through generations. They are recent, documented, happening now. And the question is, why? Why does Cragsmoor, more than a century after its destruction, still exert this influence? What is it about that place that refuses to let go? I've spent years studying abandoned estates, ghost towns, places where grand dreams collapsed. And I've learned something. Places hold memory. Not in a mystical sense, or maybe in a mystical sense, I don't know anymore. But places where intense emotion, trauma, obsession have been concentrated. Those places don't just fade. They echo. Cragsmoor was built on obsession. Frederick's desperate need to escape his father's shadow. Charles Pratt's greed. The labor of workers who were exploited and forgotten. And then there was Edward, a boy trapped in isolation, his mind unraveling, who may have set fire to the only world he knew. If places hold memory, what would Cragsmoor remember? There's a theory in psychology called place attachment. It's the idea that human identity is tied to locations. The places we grow up, the places we love, the places we suffer, they become part of us. And in extreme cases, when trauma is severe enough, the attachment doesn't end with death. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, but I'm saying that if Edward died at Cragsmoor, or if he survived only to spend the rest of his life haunting those woods, then his attachment to that place would be absolute. It would be all he had left. In 2019, a team of psychologists and historians proposed a study. They wanted to investigate the psychological effects of visiting Cragsmoor, to document the feelings of unease, disorientation, and fear that so many people reported. The hypothesis was that the site had become a trauma landscape, a place where the accumulated suffering had altered how people perceived and experienced it. The Parks Department denied the request. They said the site was too fragile for increased visitor traffic. But some of the researchers went anyway, informally off the record. They spent a weekend camping near the ruins, conducting interviews with visitors, measuring environmental factors, temperature, electromagnetic fields, air quality. Their findings were never published. But I've seen the notes, and they're disturbing. The researchers found that people who spent more than an hour within a quarter-mile of the ruins exhibited measurable psychological changes. Increased anxiety, intrusive thoughts, a persistent feeling of being watched. These effects lasted for days after leaving the site. One researcher, a clinical psychologist with 20 years of experience, described it as vicarious traumatization by proxy. As if the trauma embedded in the land could transfer to visitors. As if the place itself was contagious. I need you to understand something. I went to Cragsmoor while researching this story. I'm not superstitious. I don't scare easily. I've explored dozens of abandoned sites, ruins, places with dark histories. But Cragsmoor was different. I didn't see lights. I didn't hear voices. I didn't encounter any figure in the trees. But I felt it. The weight. The attention. The sense that something was aware of my presence. And it didn't want me there. I stayed for an hour. Took photographs. Recorded some notes. And then I left. Not because I was frightened, though I was, but because staying felt wrong. Like trespassing. Like disturbing something that should be left alone. When I got home, I reviewed my photos. Most were fine. Ruins, trees, foundation stones. But in 3 of the images I took from the same spot, seconds apart, there was a figure in the background. Tall, thin, standing among the trees. It wasn't there when I was shooting. I would have seen it. But it's in the photos. I had the images analyzed. No signs of tampering, no camera malfunction. Just a figure that shouldn't exist. I haven't been back. So we return to the question that started this investigation. What happened to Edward Church? Did he die in the fire, his body consumed so completely that nothing remained? Did he escape into the wilderness, living out his days as a hermit, forgotten by history? Or is he still there, bound to the ruins of his family's dream, unable or unwilling to leave? We don't have an answer. We will never have an answer. Because Cragsmoor, more than anything else, is a place of questions without resolution. But let's step back. Let's talk about what we do know. We know that in the 1890s, a man named Frederick Church Jr. tried to build something extraordinary. A palace on a mountain. A refuge for art. A legacy separate from his father's towering shadow. We know he didn't have the money to do it. We know he was used by Charles Pratt, by the railroad, by a financial system that chewed up ambition and spit out ruin. We know the estate was built by the hands of laborers who were paid little and remembered less. We know Frederick's son, Edward, grew up isolated and strange, and that something broke inside him. We know the estate burned. And we know that for over a century, Cragsmoor has refused to be forgotten. Here's what the story of Cragsmoor teaches us. Beauty is not free. Every grand house, every monument, every palace, they all rest on foundations of labor, money, and often suffering. The Biltmore, which I've covered before, required the work of thousands. The White House was built by enslaved people. And Cragsmoor? Cragsmoor was built on fraud, desperation, and the breaking of a family. We romanticize these places. We visit them, photograph them, admire the craftsmanship and the vision. But we rarely ask, what did this cost? Not in dollars, in lives. In sanity. In the invisible wounds that never heal. Cragsmoor forces us to ask that question. Because unlike Biltmore or the White House, Cragsmoor didn't survive. It didn't adapt. It didn't become a museum or a symbol of resilience. It died. Violently. And it stayed dead. Or maybe it didn't die. Maybe it just changed. If you're thinking about visiting Cragsmoor, and some of you will be, after watching this, I need to tell you something. Don't. I know that sounds dramatic. I know it sounds like I'm playing up the horror for effect. But I mean it. The site is protected for a reason. The warnings are real. People get lost there. People get hurt. And people leave changed. I don't know if it's Edward. I don't know if it's some environmental factor we don't understand. I don't know if it's the accumulated weight of tragedy, creating a kind of psychological trap. But something is wrong with that place. And it's not worth the risk to find out what. The Parks Department has discussed closing access entirely, removing the trails, fencing off the area, designating it a restricted zone with legal penalties for trespassing. They haven't done it yet, partly because of the historical significance, partly because of the pushback from preservationists. But it's coming. And when it does, Cragsmoor will finally be left alone. The ruins will crumble. The forest will reclaim what's left. And maybe, whatever lingers there will finally rest. I think about Edward often. A boy who never had a chance. Who was born into a family driven by ambition and wounded by pride. Who grew up in a palace that was really a prison. Who watched his father unravel, his mother despair, and the dream around him rot from the inside. What must that have been like? To be 14, 15, 16 years old, and to realize that everything you'd been told was beautiful was actually built on lies? To carve your thoughts into walls because no one would listen when you spoke? To dig a hole in the forest and lie in it, staring at the sky, try to understand what it would be like to disappear? If Edward is still there, if some part of him remains, I hope it's not suffering. I hope it's not trapped, reliving the fire, the fear, the final moments. I hope, instead, that he found a kind of peace. That the wilderness he wandered, the mountain he carved with symbols and cairns, became his sanctuary. That he finally escaped the palace, and the expectations and the weight of being a church. That he became part of the forest, free. But I don't believe that. Because the reports continue. The lights, the figures, the disorientation. Whatever is at Cragsmoor is not at peace. It's waiting. And I don't know for what. This story doesn't have a neat ending. There's no resolution, no final twist that ties everything together. Just ruins on a mountain, and questions that echo through a century. Cragsmoor stands as a monument not to beauty or art or vision, but to the dangers of ambition without foundation, to the cost of dreams built on exploitation, to the unseen hands that raise palaces and the forgotten voices that cry out when those palaces burn. And most of all, to the truth that some places, once broken, can never be repaired. They can only be left behind. So here's my final thought. Can beauty make you immortal? George Vanderbilt built Biltmore, and it endures, admired by millions. Frederick Church Sr. painted masterpieces that still hang in museums. But Frederick Church Jr.? He built Cragsmoor. And Cragsmoor made him a ghost. Not in the literal sense, though perhaps in that sense too, but in the sense that he disappeared. His life, his struggles, his failure, they were erased from the popular narrative. You won't find him in the standard histories of the Gilded Age. You won't find Edward in any memorial or archive. They became ghosts because their story was too uncomfortable to tell. A story of fraud and collapse, and a boy who may have burned it all down rather than live in the lie one more day. But I've told it now. And maybe that's a kind of immortality too. The Cragsmoor estate is gone, but its memory remains. In the stones slowly sinking into the earth. In the symbols carved on trees. In the stories told by people who hiked too close and felt the weight of something watching. And in you now. Because you've heard the story. You know about Frederick and Edward and the palace that became a pyre. You know about the invisible hands and the unpaid debts and the lights that still dance through the ruins on certain nights. And you'll remember, that's the thing about dark stories. They don't fade. They find new ears, new voices, new generations to carry them forward. So if you take anything from this investigation, take this. Every beautiful thing has a shadow. Every palace has a foundation you can't see. And some ruins refuse to be ruins. They remain alive in the worst possible way. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been to a place that felt wrong? A place where the history was so heavy you could feel it in your bones? Share your story, because places like Cragsmoor exist all over. Hidden, forgotten, waiting. And maybe, by telling their stories, we can finally let them rest. Or maybe we just make sure no one else gets lost in them. I'll see you in the next investigation.